Jesus said, "I was hungry and you gave me something to eat." Addressing hunger on a broad scale and even on a small scale is an important part of our faith tradition, whatever that may be. What motivates someone to answer a call to give their life specifically to that end? Jeremy Everett of the Texas Hunger Initiative is going to be our guest to talk about his journey and this work. Stay tuned for Good God. Welcome to Good God, conversations that matter about faith and public life. I'm your host, George Mason, and I'm pleased to welcome to the program today Jeremy Everett. Jeremy?
Yeah, it's good to be here.
Glad to have you with us.
Thank you.
Jeremy is the Executive Director of the Baylor Collaborative on Hunger and Poverty.
That's right.
All right, say that with me, everyone. Right?
That's right.
So all these long titles and whatnot. But it actually goes descriptively into what you do. And
Sure.
all of those words matter, don't they, Jeremy, in
They
terms
do.
of how you're addressing things collaboratively as a style,
Yep.
also because it's coming out of Baylor University, very connected, I think, to the School of Social Work also,
Yes,
is it not?
Yeah, it was originally. It was originally a part of the Texas Hunger Initiative, which was born in the School of Social Work.
Okay, very
Yes,
good.
that's right.
Terrific. And you are an author, and this new book is titled, "I Was Hungry." The strike-through is significant as well.
It is.
So that we begin to develop our imagination about that being a thing we can say in the past.
That's right.
I was hungry. But the subtitle is Cultivating Common Ground to End an American Crisis. We'll talk more about the book along the way.
Great.
But I know that eradicating hunger, elevating people, all of this comes out of a deep spiritual calling for you. And I think it would be really important to say that there are a lot of people who seem to have a desire to do public policy work, a desire to see people helped. Sometimes that work is exhausting, and unless you have a sense of that inner core, a place from which it springs.
That's right.
It's really difficult to sustain it. So I'd be interested to know about how this comes to be for you.
Yes, that's a great question. I think oftentimes when I'm talking to our students, I talk about if you want to deal with a big social problem, it doesn't matter if it's hunger or poverty or human trafficking, that you really need to be steeped in three things. One, proximity. So you have to have proximity to the problem, and as Brian Stevenson says, you can't solve a social problem from a distance.
That's right.
The second thing is research. So you need to understand the issue, even beyond your own personal experience, even when you have been immersed in the issue. And the third is your faith tradition. Your faith tradition both helps you have a framework for understanding your call to love your neighbor as yourself, your responsibility to your brothers and sisters who oftentimes live in broken social situations where injustice is pervasive. But it's also, it's what restores you. It's what keeps you going.
It really does, isn't it? Yeah.
It is.
And we both of us are Baptists and
Yes.
Baptist ministers, and we come therefore out of a branch of the Christian tradition that has a high value on personal experience with
Right.
God.
Right.
Right. So while we are not maybe as doctrinally ordered, we are highly spiritual in terms of the individual relationship that we have with God. And yours also is steeped in ministry in your family history. So you were
Right.
very much set up for this in certain ways, weren't you?
Right. Well, we joke that ministry is the family business.
Yes.
And so my father and grandfather and we're both Baptist ministers. My uncles are Baptist ministers. My mom's father was a farmer, but led singing at a primitive Baptist church in rural Alabama. So it was.
Yeah, but let's listen to that.
That's right.
He was a farmer.
That's right. He was.
Agriculture, hunger.
Yes.
A lot of streams coming together.
That's right.
Which probably also goes, Jeremy, to the point when people hear us talk a lot of times about calling, right? If you aren't steeped in the tradition of what vocational calling is. You might think that that's sort of a answer the phone type
That's
thing,
right.
or you
That's
might
right.
think it's one of those unique, rare experiences of a saint who hears a voice.
Yep.
Right. Normally, it comes through these more natural channels, doesn't it?
It really does. In many respects, you begin to see, to your point, who you were created to be, maybe from the get-go. When I was first trying to identify who I was called to be, the first place I went was Jeremiah 1. Here I was named for the prophet Jeremiah, which I always lament because I have a tendency to cry every time I tell a story, and I'm like, why the weeping prophet? Why
The
not
weeping
another
prophet,
one?
about lament.
That's right.
Exactly.
That's right. But
Yeah.
but in Jeremiah 1, God is saying, before you're even in the womb, I knew who you are, and so I think those are the moments that help connect us. I never in my life would have, certainly growing up, would have imagined that I would be working on issues of hunger and poverty, or being able to see the correlation between my one grandfather being a farmer, another being a minister. And seeing both of those bear, literal fruit in certain circumstances for people in poverty. But it's been interesting. So calling is very much a part of how I identify what I experienced to address this issue.
In your book, you talk a bit about your calling
Yeah.
and about your Franciscan moment.
Yes.
And I think you should say a little more about St. Francis and the role that played
Yeah.
he played in your call experience and trying to understand that, because it also helps make sense of a much larger part of your mission.
Sure.
As a result, not just a calling to serve God, but the way you do it.
Yes. Yeah. Well, for me, so I. Being a Baptist preacher's kid, we joked that my dad only has 3 years worth of sermons, and so we moved a lot. And oftentimes we might be at a place where my father would pastor a congregation where maybe the member of Congress or the mayor or the business leaders of a community might be a part of. But then I would play basketball with kids that came from a very different context, oftentimes that lived in the projects. And so I might spend some of my time with friends who are from very affluent areas, and then other times playing basketball in a housing project. And when I got to college, those two things, the inequity that I saw on a daily basis, which really didn't resonate with me probably until I got to college, really began to be called to the conscious level. And once it was at the conscious level, I was wrestling with it for years and asking religious leaders and professors, what do I do about this? And also probably feeling guilty about growing up in a middle-class household. And many of whom told me, listen, you should feel grateful for what you grew up with. And that's probably truth for most people. It wasn't truth for me at that time in life. And it really, I didn't find truth until I found the story of St. Francis. And that was by happenstance, turning on a TV and the movie Brother, Sun, Sister, Moon, which is early 70s film, happened to be on, and watching the story of St. Francis unfold, where he ultimately realizes that his possessions are prohibiting him from loving his neighbor as himself, and choosing to live outside of the safety of the city in a life that's intertwined with beggars, and it had a profound impact on me. And so at that point, that's when I knew that's my answer. And so for me, I gathered up all my stuff, and I was in college in Birmingham and drove over the little mountain into downtown Birmingham from where I was, and gave away my stuff to the homeless living in downtown Birmingham. And at that point, I knew I was called to the issue of poverty. I had no idea what that meant, but I knew that that was what God was prompting me to do.
So from that, you began quickly to have an awakening of how just giving your stuff away doesn't necessarily transform the ones you're giving it to as much as maybe it does you, right?
Yes.
Which is also part of this important thing of solidarity.
Yes.
The reciprocity of this sort of ministry is very important. A lifestyle that allows us to be acted upon and us to be affected by our engagement with people is where we need ultimately to be, I think, spiritually when we're involved in these things, and you were learning that in that moment. But the backpack story, I think, the camping equipment story, is also interesting to me in terms of how you realize that there has to be a larger systemic change that happens than just the anecdotal give your stuff away.
That's right. I was, when I gave away, my prized possessions were my backpacking equipment.
Mm-hmm.
And I gave it to a homeless man, and went back the next week to check on the man, try to build a relationship, and he had taken those possessions and sold them for drugs. And I didn't know at the time the high rate of debilitating mental health issues that many of our homeless people deal with, and how drugs and alcohol are oftentimes their coping mechanism because they can't afford medication, and our mental health system is inadequate, to say the least. And so it was that was an eye opener for me, that this was not going to be like a 1972 Zeffirelli film with me walking off in the sunset holding hands with the poor. It was going to be that this situation was complicated, and that it was probably going to take a lifetime worth of commitment to addressing the issue. So that, I think you're right. I think it's, but at the same time, before that act had happened, I saw people as a means to my end.
Nice. Okay.
And so
this is insight.
It wasn't until the giving away of my possessions that I began to see people as an end in of themselves.
Okay.
Where they are created in the image of God, just like I am, and they are worthy of relationship, just to be in relationship with them. That if I am hungry and I want to eat a sandwich, that they're hungry and they may want to eat a sandwich too. And so, just the very basic tendency to care for their basic necessities, but also just to be in relationship with people and to not use them for your own means.
So this sort of goes back to the St. Francis story as well, doesn't it? Because I love that we're sitting here, Baptist ministers, having a conversation about a 14th century friar whose influence is still profound upon us today. But here's St. Francis, who ends up stripping naked in front of the public in his town. The bishop is there. His father, the merchant, is there. And in that moment, he has to say, in effect, I no longer have a father on earth. I only have a father in heaven. And the sense of solidarity with all humanity in that moment, where he was not willing to define himself by the privileges of being the son of a wealthy merchant, is what's so crucial in the significance of his influence, I think, right? So when you say that people are not instrumental for us, they are ends unto themselves, I think this is part of the secret of that. And so much of what we deal with in our society is about finding competitive advantages for ourselves and our children over other people and their children, right, in our society. So when we look at public policy, when we look at choices of schools, when we look at how we make decisions, if everything is instrumental to that end for what it will do for us, it leads to one sense of consequence, right? But if people are ends unto themselves, it really is a different calculus altogether, isn't it?
It really is. I mean, then there becomes an inherent question of equity.
Right.
And and we have to spend time really kind of unpacking what that means. And you hear people oftentimes say, you're looking for an equity of opportunity, maybe not an outcome per se, but yeah. I mean, so if we're intent on seeing brothers and sisters, so in this passage, I really don't write about this in the book, but Jesus is, for those who are familiar with this, the Matthew 25 passage that the
Right.
book is named for. Jesus said, "For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat, and I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink, and a stranger, and you welcomed me." And he goes on to say that, you know, when the righteous say, "When do we do this for you?" You know,
Right.
and he said, "When you did it to the least of these who are members of my family, you did it for me."
Mm-hmm.
So in this passage, Jesus identifies people who are poor, who are hungry, who are immigrants as members of his family.
Yes.
The rest of us are judged by how we treated members of his family.
Yes.
And so it requires a complete reorientation of how we structure policy, of how we structure our cities, of how we structure our public schools, of
Right.
where we want our kids to go swim, and where we want to invest our resources.
So let's put a pause right there, and we're going to take a break and come back. And I want to go back to Matthew 25.
Okay.
Who are members of his family, and talk about that a little more,
Great.
because it does have everything to do with the consequences you're suggesting right there. So
Yep.
we'll be right back.
Great.
Okay. Thank you for continuing to tune in to Good God. This program is made possible by the contributions of friends of the program, and we are delighted that they continue to support it so generously so that we don't have to ask for additional support every episode. I'm sure you're glad about that too. If you'd like to know where else you can tune in to find Good God, whether in a video format or audio, or even to get a transcript of the program, go to www.goodgodproject.com. That's our website, and it's the best place to go to receive an archive of all the previous episodes and to get a new one each week if you'd like. Thanks again for your support. We're back with Jeremy Everett of the Baylor University Collaborative on Hunger and Poverty, which includes the Texas Hunger Initiative, with an ambition to eradicate hunger in Texas as a state and collaborate on a larger basis than that. Jeremy, we were just talking about the spiritual motivation, the biblical vision that you highlighted and that you used in the title of your book, I Was Hungry. This is a phrase from Jesus in Matthew 25. And you were saying that what's so important is Jesus ends that passage by saying, "Inasmuch as you did it unto the least of these who are members of my family, you have done it unto me." You identified the members of his family with all those that he just talked about.
That's right.
The hungry, the stranger, etc. Now there's an important consequence of that you mentioned, and that is that then we need to follow that into, all right, then how do we relate to members of his family if we're going to be judged that way? There is another interpretation of that passage that we are increasingly seeing come out of Christian circles that limits members of Jesus' family to his disciples. To those who were among his 12 and the small band who were hungry and thirsty and who were in prison and who were all of that. And the idea here is to say to people more broadly, the way you treat Christians who are vulnerable is the way you'll be judged by God. The consequence of that interpretation, of course, is to further the division between us and them, insider, outsider, as if you are part of the elect, part of the disciples of the church,
Right.
who the church is.
Yep.
Now religious liberty issues are really about protecting Christians.
Yep.
And then you'll be blessed, by the way, if you do
Yep.
that. Public policy, we don't really have to care for everyone who is hungry, who is a prisoner, who is
Yep.
vulnerable. We just need to make sure that we are protecting the interests of those who are hungry in the church. This
Right.
then has a whole other political consequence to
That's
it,
right.
doesn't it? And it's really the argument going on in America today between those who support the current policies that are being put forward by this administration and supported by 81% of American evangelicals. what I'm getting at here is this is two radically different visions that grow out of a faith tradition and out of biblical interpretation.
Yeah.
And the consequences of it, if we don't even see that they are eternal, they are certainly massive temporally, aren't they?
That's right. That's right. Well, I think, so let's start with the text.
Yes.
So that this is the only apocalyptic or eschatological scene in the entire Gospel of Matthew. And let's be kind of literalist as we look at the text for a second. So when Jesus is speaking, when he's returned in this apocalyptic scene, he is returned as the king this time, and he gathers all the people,
all of them,
not some of the people. He gathers all the people,
and
he begins to separate them: the sheep and the goats, the righteous from the accused. And to the astonishment of the people gathered, he doesn't mention anything in this passage. Keep in mind, this is the only eschatological scene in the entire Gospel of Matthew. He doesn't say anything in this passage about grace, justification, the forgiveness of sins.
Whether you accepted Jesus Christ as your personal Lord and Savior and were baptized by immersion.
That's right. It does not come up. The only thing that comes up, what constitutes as a decisive criterion for judgment, is whether or not a person had acted with love and cared for the needy. Essentially, when people responded or failed to respond to people in need, they in fact responded or failed to respond to Christ. So oftentimes we act like these actions are just extra credit.
Yes.
But in fact, they are part and parcel. They are the core part, the core tenet of our belief system. If we are going to take Scripture for what it's suggesting in Matthew 25.
And this doesn't have to alter our sense of what orthodoxy is theologically.
Sure, right.
It actually, though, should orient it differently.
That's right.
Right? So now what we may have to do is to go back to examine who is Jesus, and if he is, as Richard Rohr likes to call him, the universal Christ, that is to say, everything that has to do with this apocalyptic scene has to do with what God is up to in Christ in the world.
Absolutely.
And Jesus becomes shorthand for the larger way in which God is dealing with the world, not the sort of snapshot of this moment in history where we get an eject button somehow if we're in the right position and say the right words.
That's right. Well, you bring up Rohr and thinking about the Franciscan tradition. Francis really kind of introduced the idea of not just orthodoxy, right belief, but also orthopraxy, right practice. And so I think holding those two things in concert are certainly what we see in this passage. So it's not that we, oftentimes people think, well, first I need to take care of my own family and make sure that my own family is well taken care of, and that certainly makes sense. And you might even can extend that to your own congregation or your own, even the own Christian household. But it certainly doesn't stop there. And if we really believe that all people are created in the image of God, then we need to treat them that way.
Yes.
And just as we would hope that they would treat us if circumstances found us differently, if we are members of Jesus' family, and whom he does not say are people that have said a particular creed, but people that are experiencing injustice on this side of the sweet by and by, as we might say in the old
Okay, so let's talk about injustice for a moment, because you raised that word, and you raised the concept, and now we're talking about the hunger in particular.
Yep.
There is a distinction between charity and justice that I think is important to make here. Much of the work you do is going beyond charity to a much more structural question, to a much more compelling public vision of our life together in the world that is not just about the wealthy who are philanthropic and who are helping people on an ad hoc basis. Not that that's bad, but so it seems to me that what we have is a system that is currently in place where our laws and policies and our operating principles together publicly are making people vulnerable. So to begin with, the structural things create insecurity. Then charity is supposed to come underneath those to strengthen them and to heal those insecurities so that we can get level. When it seems to me that's just the opposite of what it should be. It's backwards. So if you start out with the idea that we all understand in our common life together in neighborliness that we got to get the infrastructure right, that we need all of the justice matters taking place. Now, if charity comes on top of that to move people from a starting place of security to opportunity, what a difference that would make publicly, right?
That would.
But instead, we're always starting with this charitable, and then we get to cherry pick someone got out of the hood, you know.
Right.
And if everybody would just be like so-and-so, you know, this one, that's not the way you operate, though. I mean, your whole work is to strengthen the infrastructure and to change the conversation there.
That's right. That's
so
right.
How do you help people understand that distinction when you go talk to them?
Yeah, it's a great great observation and a great imagery that you're using in terms of charity and justice. And I think where I find charity important is that charity helps people through today.
Okay.
And it may not bring about just systems, but because there is so much brokenness in our communities, because you have 40 million people who live in poverty and hunger, and and really true poverty is probably more like the 200% of the poverty level in terms of that's really where you need to be if you're going to be able to make ends meet, and that's 100 million Americans when you talk about that.
Wow.
So if you think about it from that end, these folks oftentimes need some interventions that are going to help them through today, and those are important. The problem is if we stop there.
Right.
And we're not also working to build just systems. And an analogy I use a lot with our folks is, so the first inner city house I moved into was this old house in North Waco, and it had a really bad plumbing problem. Every time we ran the sink or turned on the shower, we could just hear it echoing down at the underneath the house and creating puddles. And that plumbing problem was unpleasant, and eventually that unpleasant plumbing problem seeped out into our front yard. Ugh. And so it was nasty. And we called our landlord repeatedly to get them to come fix it, and they never did. And finally, the police threatened to have our house red tagged, essentially have it torn down and vacated if they didn't come fix the problem. Still took a while to get the landlord to send somebody over, but eventually he did. He sent a plumber over. The plumber assessed the situation and basically said, you're going to have to repipe the whole house. And so I told the landlord that, and the landlord sent the plumber to Home Depot or some shop. And when he came back, he returned with concrete steps. And he put the concrete steps through the sludge in the front yard, and he got back in his truck and he left. And we were just shocked that was the solution to the plumbing problem that we had for our house, was putting in concrete steps. And those concrete steps, had they probably prevented us from getting sick, because we'd have to walk through the sludge. But if that was the long-term solution, they probably would have eroded, over time repeatedly, and ultimately probably would have cost more, than fixing the problem. When the police officer came back by and saw that was the solution to the problem, he was ready to have the house vacated immediately. And then that caused the landlord to ultimately come back and send the plumber over and fix the pipes in the house. If you think about that, where we're at as a nation, we need those charitable interventions. We need those concrete steps of charity that help people make it through today so that they're not experiencing something awful. But at the same time, we got to get under the house and build the pipes of justice. If we don't, then if we don't fix these broken pipes of injustice, then ultimately we're going to lose the investment that we've built. We've built this nation in many respects is a wonderful country, and but if we don't take the time to build a system that is just for everybody, it's going to ultimately cost us our whole house.
Wow, I just think that's a beautiful place for us to push the pause button here again, because I want to have you back to do another episode on this. But the pipes of justice, fixing the pipes of justice, and the truth is we we don't all do that willingly. We have to sometimes exert pressure on people
Right.
to do so, and that sometimes gets uncomfortable. And for people of faith to organize, to challenge people to change their behavior, to change public policy, to confront municipal, state, federal officials, to get them to do the right thing, right, is sometimes unpleasant for us, because as people of faith and in congregations, we like to make everybody happy. But
right.
sometimes this is the important work we have to do.
Yeah.
And we'll get to talking more about the Texas Hunger Initiative now and hunger itself in our next episode. But Jeremy,
Great.
thank you so much for being with us on Good God.
Of course.
Good.
Thank you.
That-